Fiona, thank you so much for agreeing to answer these questions today as an experienced supply teacher. How often are you on the receiving end of violence, either physical or verbal, from students?
Looking back, I realise I've never been subjected in school to direct physical violence. I've been in situations where a child is being violent to furniture, or there's been some level of violence to other children, sometimes mutual, sometimes it's a child who's too exuberant and the other child is traumatised by it. But I've had a lot of verbal talk back and verbal just temper and so on. And I know that some of that is because children do find it a shock to be faced with a different teacher, especially if they've not expected it. But no, I've seen a lot of behaviour. I've experienced a lot of behavioural issues, but direct physical violence, surprisingly, I've heard a lot of it happening to regular class teachers, but maybe because I'm temporary, it hasn't built up to that.
Thank you very much. And I wonder if some supply teachers might experience that more than others, depending on what sort of demographic they teach in, or perhaps secondary level compared to primary level.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. So our next question is, what makes a good school to work in?
I think the obvious answers are that you have, it's the people, it's other teachers who are ready and willing to answer your questions and who have the time for you and aren't too stressed and so on. But if I could go on a total tangent here, my husband, for his second master's degree, he had to do a module on urban studies, and he was studying into some sort of new towns experiment in Europe, where they made a totally ergonomic, geometrically designed city. And they thought this would be the best place for people to live in. And then after a few months, they found that adults who were living in these geometrical shapes, you could go anywhere in the city and you could be anywhere else, started getting mental health problems. Now, the reason why that stuck in my head was because I've been around so many hundreds of schools over the years, and there are schools where, oh, brand new school, everything's lovely, any classroom round the quadrangle could be any other classroom, everything's a rectangle, everything's a straight line. And then I've been in some schools where you have to lead your class through a gym cupboard to get down to assembly, and then you have to go around 3 corners and trip over this and that. And you would think that the first kind of school I described, the children would be calmer and more tractable, and it's totally the opposite. And when I go to a funny shaped school where the building's been extended 3 times and it's all the wrong shape and it's quite awkward and so on like that, children seem to be calmer and happy, just happier somehow. And that connects in my mind to what my husband was doing about city studies, where living inside closed rectangles and anywhere you are could be anywhere else is bad for mental health. And councils are spending millions and millions on building these total rectangles to enclose children in. And I wonder if maybe this should be rethought.
That's a very interesting point. Not something I've ever considered, Fiona.
Not something anyone has considered.
No. And I know there was a school that I worked in for 3 months, and one thing about it was the way it was designed, the sun really didn't come through the windows, and it seemed like a very dark, kind of depressing school. You walked down the corridors, there was no light, you couldn't see the displays. And for me personally, as a teacher, when I walked in through those corridors every single day, I kind of felt a little bit gloomy. Whereas I've been in hundreds of other schools, I kind of get a feeling, like an uplifting feeling as I come in. There's more kind of energy, more light. And I think you've raised an important point about, you know, a school can bring a certain feeling to you depending on, you know, how it's designed. So yeah, that's something I hadn't really thought about too much until just now. I'm going to move on to our last question. So do you feel as valued as other key workers, for example, NHS staff, when the schools often don't provide PPE and you don't get paid for school holidays?
Well, as for not being paid for school holidays, there is a sort, I think wages are spread to some extent in different councils in Scotland. So there are going to be times of the year I know I get this money, but because I don't sort of spend to the bottom of the bank account each month, I spend sparingly, then it doesn't bite. I know that if you basically spend your bank balance each month, then it will bite. But as far as feeling valued goes, I think that a lot of teachers have really suffered from the fear and the stress of the pandemic, the knowing that they have to go back to work and knowing that they're going to have children sneezing on them and coughing on them and being sick on them and so on. And while I've never enjoyed being subjected to body fluids, my own attitude to the whole pandemic thing is possibly affected by the fact that I think I and my family had met the virus back in April.
Okay.
And I'd already done my reading, obviously, and had read as much as anyone knew at that time. So there I was, taking the vitamin D, taking the quercetin, doing the exercise, so that even though I'm in my 50s, we were all really going to be low risk. And I suppose I was fearful at that time because I didn't know. Mm-hmm. Nobody really knew back then. And health workers were dying and nobody knew why people were catching it before they were symptomatic and so on. It's very, very different now. I know that there are impairment issues if you've had long COVID and so on like that. But I would think that the fear aspect, that's caused some suffering among teachers. But I wonder, it's not the same as what health workers went through at the start of the pandemic. One school I was working in, just after schools opened, COVID had already, not for certain, but probably been through that school in March. And the level of stress about it among the teachers was just so much lower. They had their COVID policy, but they didn't feel oppressed and scared and doomed and all the rest. Mm-hmm. So it would be good if knowledge about COVID, the understanding of what the statistics mean now, could be used to reassure teachers that yes, it's not that you're not valued, it's just that the dangers are lower and schools cannot stay closed indefinitely. And to some extent, teachers are at risk anyway. I mean, I get, most springs, I get a string of colds and flus that lasts months, and I'm sort of impaired for about 4 months of the year anyway.
Okay, thank you. So I suppose an attitude of, this is the situation, this is how much control I have over it, just get on with it best I can sort of philosophy, would you say?
It sounds insensitive to say that teachers should just get on with it, because if a teacher has severe health problems, or if they're in their 60s or whatever, then that's a harsh thing to say. But the medics in the spring who had to just get on with it at risk of their own lives before the virus was understood, it was a lot worse for them than it is for teachers.
Okay.
And so I don't think that, I mean, obviously, if I think I've already had the virus, then my own fear is going to be lower, because if I get it again, I wouldn't expect to get it badly. Mm-hmm. But I think that teachers should, to some extent, be given the information that's going to reassure genuinely, and not just told, deal with it.
So Fiona, that's all my questions, but do you have anything else that you'd like to share before we finish this video today?
I found a lot of your questions really, really interesting. A lot of them are really worthwhile deserving an answer. I chose just a few of them because I knew that I was going to get long-winded. So I've really enjoyed answering the questions that you asked, and I know I went off on my tangents to some extent. Thank you very much. It was an interesting exercise for me.
Thank you very much, Fiona. It's been great hearing the thoughts of a supply teacher with your experience on these matters, so I do appreciate that.